She was born into everything: wealth, legacy, and a name that could silence rooms. But behind those velvet curtains of privilege, Edith Wharton was hiding something no one in her world dared to imagine. They called her the chronicler of high society, the woman who exposed the lies of the Gilded Age. But the one truth she never wrote about was her own. It was 1862 in New York City, and the city had two identities. The one the public saw, opulent, grand, glimmering with carriages, diamonds and soirées, and the one Edith knew, silent corridors, frigid expectations, women who weren't allowed to think, let alone speak. Edith Jones was born into this world, but she never truly belonged to it. By the time she was 12, Edith had already written her first novella, not printed, not published, written, stitched by hand, bound with ribbons, and buried in her dresser drawer like a secret. Because even for a girl as wealthy as Edith, intelligence wasn't something to display. It was something to conceal. Her mother, Lucretia, disapproved of almost everything she did. Not because Edith was misbehaving, but because she was thinking. Thinking made a girl difficult, and difficult girls didn't marry well. Still, the world outside her bedroom window was evolving. Whispers of scandal moved through parlors like perfume. Divorces were no longer unthinkable. Theaters showed women on stage without shame, and Edith quietly watched it all. But the louder the world got, the quieter she became, until the silence began to suffocate her. At 19, Edith was tall, statuesque, and pale. To some, she looked like a marble sculpture, untouchable, poised. But inside, her chest was a war zone. She had never kissed anyone. She had never confessed how often she thought about leaving. Not just her house, not just New York, but the entire identity that had been stitched around her since birth. And then, without warning, they arranged her marriage. Edward Robbins Wharton, Teddy as the world called him, was handsome, well-bred, and entirely wrong. Where Edith craved thought, Teddy craved distraction. He loved hunting, horses, parties. She loved solitude, philosophy, the ancient ruins of Italy. On paper, they looked like a portrait. At 23, she became Edith Wharton, and that sips when the double life began. By day, she was Mrs. Wharton, hosting luncheons, exchanging pleasantries, walking the tightrope of Gilded Age femininity. But by night, she wrote, obsessively, furtively, under candlelight, when Teddy was asleep or away. Fiction became her only mirror, and in that mirror she began to confront what she could never say aloud. Her first major success came in 1905 with the House of Mirth. The New York elite read it like a funhouse reflection, laughing at the characters, not realizing they were reading about themselves. But Edith didn't laugh. She had created Lily Bart, a woman destroyed by the same world Edith smiled through every day. It wasn't just a novel, it was a warning, and it was ignored. The higher her literary star rose, the lower her marriage sank. Teddy grew restless, reckless, rumors of affairs, gambling, long absences. Edith never confronted him directly, but in her writing, she carved him into characters, weak men, charming on the surface, hollow inside. He was everything Teddy wasn't: a journalist, a foreigner, fluent in flirtation, in poetry, in secrets. They met in Paris. At first, it was correspondence, then tea, then walks. He made her feel seen, not just watched. For the first time in her life, Edith felt like a woman, not a specimen. She was 45, and she fell in love. But she couldn't have him. Not fully, not openly. Their affair, if it can be called that, was a flicker, a secret she carried like a flame in her palm, too bright to ignore, too dangerous to expose. When it ended, she didn't cry. She wrote, that same year she began the Age of Innocence, and though it was set decades earlier, it wasn't history, it was confession. Newland Archer, Ellen Olenska, a man torn between duty and desire, a woman exiled for wanting more, a world that demanded silence, then punished you for obeying. Critics called it her masterpiece. They didn't realize it was her diary. She won the Pulitzer Prize, the first woman in history to do so. But instead of celebration, she felt something else, a sharp, quiet ache, because the one person she wanted to share it with, Morton, was gone. And Teddy, he never understood what she had built, what she had survived. She never remarried. She never stopped writing. But her heart, once cracked, never sealed completely again. In her final years, Edith moved to France. The war came, bombs fell, and yet she stayed, organizing hospitals, sheltering refugees, earning medals from governments that had once ignored her. Even then, even in chaos, she was a woman holding the world together with words. But when she died in 1937, there was no great fanfare, no parade, just silence. Her name was already fading from dinner conversations. The age she had exposed was burying her with it. And yet, her secret wasn't gone. It was waiting. In letters, in manuscripts, in notes tucked between pages, and one day the world would find it. Her story, the real one. Not the one she let them read, but the one she lived and loved in the shadows. They said the Gilded Age was a time of grand facades, but no one wore a more elegant mask than Edith Wharton. She had married Edward "Teddy" Wharton, a man as charming as he was hollow. He gave her status, a last name that fit nicely on stationery, and a home in Newport with ceilings so high they echoed with emptiness. But what he couldn't give her, or wouldn't, was understanding. He didn't read. He didn't care for art or poetry. He didn't know that sometimes Edith cried in the middle of the night, not because she was sad, but because she was suffocating. Teddy loved the idea of a wife, but he never truly saw her. But inside, something had cracked open. Writing wasn't just a hobby, it was a rebellion. Each story became a mirror to her surroundings. The cold dinners, the stiff corsets, the lives built like perfect prisons. And yet no one in her world saw it. Not yet. Then in the spring of 1899, she received a letter from a man whose name she didn't recognize, Morton Fullerton, a journalist in Paris, a friend of Henry James. He had read her stories. He admired her intellect. He wanted to meet. She didn't respond at first, but she couldn't stop thinking about him, about someone, somewhere, who had seen her mind through her words, who hadn't just seen the lines but the spaces between them. Weeks passed, then months, and still his letter sat hidden beneath her manuscripts. And one day, in a flash of defiance, she wrote back. What began as literary admiration soon became emotional intoxication. His letters were electric. He wrote like a man who had nothing to lose, and she read them like a woman who had already lost too much. In those letters, she wasn't Mrs. Wharton, she was Edith, complex, passionate, brilliant. He quoted her lines back to her. He dissected her metaphors. He made her feel like a woman, not a wife. Paris didn't just smell different. It breathed different. The air tasted like freedom. She met Fullerton at the Gare Saint-Lazare. He was taller than she expected, sharper. His eyes studied her like she was both a riddle and the answer. They walked along the Seine. She forgot what it felt like to be afraid. The first time he kissed her, she didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think of Teddy or scandal or ruin. She only thought, this is the first time someone has ever touched me like I matter. Days bled into weeks. Her writing flourished. Her body awakened. And for the first time in her life, Edith Wharton wasn't hiding in fiction. She was living it. But Paris didn't belong to her, and neither did Fullerton. He was a man of many affairs. Rumors surrounded him like fog. Women in Vienna, debts in London, secrets too complicated to untangle. Edith had known. She had always known. Still, she had hoped. When she discovered a letter tucked into his coat, a love note, but not from her, the illusion shattered. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She returned to her hotel, pulled out a blank page, and began to write. That night, she penned the first lines of the House of Mirth. She returned to America days later, changed, hardened, and more dangerous than ever. Because now Edith knew love was fleeting, but words could outlive betrayal. She poured her rage, her disillusionment, and her brilliance into every chapter. Lily Bart was beautiful, ambitious, and trapped by a society that valued silence over soul. Readers devoured it. Critics called it brutal and honest and dazzling. Edith smiled behind her fan, knowing every sentence carried blood. And still, no one in her circle suspected. Teddy read it halfway and said it was too dark. Her mother asked why the heroine had to die. Henry James, her dear friend, said it was her finest work. But only one person, one shadow from her Paris days, sent her a single telegram that read, "You are magnificent, and I am sorry." She didn't yet reply. As fame grew, so did the cracks in her marriage. Teddy became erratic, jealous, prone to outbursts. He accused her of affairs, though he could never prove them. He smashed a porcelain vase once when she corrected his grammar. Her staff whispered behind doors. The doctors said nervous instability. Edith called it what it was, a soul unraveling. And yet she stayed, for years. Until one morning, standing in her sunlit study, she looked at her reflection and didn't recognize the woman in the glass. Not the girl from Newport, not the lover from Paris, not the wife, not the writer. Just a ghost, floating between who she was and who she might have been. She packed her things that afternoon, quietly, decisively. She left the house before Teddy returned. No letter, no announcement, no final words. Just silence, the same silence she had once mastered, now weaponized. The headlines came days later: Mrs. Wharton leaves husband, no explanation given. But she didn't need one. The world would understand soon enough. Because she was already halfway through writing Ethan Frome, a love story wrapped in ice, betrayal, and everything she could never say aloud. Edith Wharton had once been society's perfect woman. Now she was its most dangerous storyteller, and she was just getting started. The Paris sun warmed the streets like a secret whispered between lovers. Edith walked along the Seine, her gloved fingers grazing the spine of a new book she hadn't read yet. She liked to carry them unopened, like a promise. Her steps were slow, deliberate, careful not to rush. Paris didn't like haste, and Edith had learned how to breathe in silence, the way only those hiding something truly profound ever do. She had escaped New York's golden cage, but not without scars. Teddy's last letter remained folded in her drawer, yellowing and untouched, a relic of a life that had collapsed in on itself. He hadn't said goodbye. Not really. He had just unraveled, word by word, until even his handwriting betrayed him. A shaky "your husband," signed like a ghost. She told herself it was mercy, that she had spared him a slow death by leaving, that he would survive better without her. But sometimes, in the deep, echoing chambers of her Paris apartment, the silence argued back. He wasn't the kind of man you described with adjectives. He was more of a verb, something that happened to you. British-born, Oxford-educated, a correspondent for the Times of London, and with eyes that had seen too much. He smiled like he was lying and kissed like he was telling the truth. They met at a literary salon, of course. Edith was reading Baudelaire aloud when she noticed him across the room. He leaned against the doorframe like he owned time, watching her not as a writer but as a woman. She tripped on the final stanza. He noticed that too. And then it happened. She let him kiss her. It wasn't a teenage surrender, nor a desperate grasp for youth. It was quiet, like slipping into warm water after a long winter. She didn't think about the scandal, or Teddy, or the risk of being seen with a man like Morton. She only thought about how, for the first time, someone touched her not because of what she had written, but because of what she had never said out loud. But Edith knew love, especially forbidden love, was never just romance. It was politics, and shame, and shadows. They met in borrowed apartments, exchanged letters in codes, and made up lies more poetic than their novels. He wrote, "To love you is to become fluent in silence." She replied, "Then let's sit, never speak again." But love has rules, and Fullerton, charming as he was not built for devotion. There were rumors, other women, whispers of men too. Edith didn't want to believe them. Not at first, but Paris talked. And one evening, as she waited for him in a lace-trimmed dress she'd never worn before, the clock ticked past midnight, and the door never opened. He didn't say come. The affair didn't end with a scream. It evaporated, slowly, invisibly, like steam from a forgotten cup of tea. And Edith, ever the novelist, knew how to write the perfect ending. She burned his letters. She erased his name from her diary. But in her stories, he remained, hidden, fictionalized, alive. In The Reef, in the Age of Innocence, in Ethan Frome, he lived in shadows and metaphors. Readers thought they were stories, but they were autopsies. Still, the world adored her. And behind every acceptance speech, every published review and every book signing, there was that ache, that one man who had almost made her forget her own brilliance, the one who reminded her she was flesh before she was mind. Years passed. The Gilded Age decayed into memory. The Astors faded. The mansions turned into museums. Edith, ever timeless, kept writing, but now with less rage and more grief. It was his handwriting. She hesitated, heart pounding like a young girl's. But when she opened it, it wasn't a declaration or an apology. It was a confession. And by the time he was ready, she was gone. She closed the letter. No tears, no gasps, just silence. Because she had known all along, but some things aren't meant to be read. They're meant to be written. She stood, lit a match, and watched the page curl into flame. The past, she thought, had its own bookshelf, and hers was finally full. Paris didn't ask questions. It was the one place where Edith Wharton could walk into a room and not be haunted by her name. But names, as she knew too well, had a strange way of echoing louder the longer you tried to bury them. Hers, Edith Wharton, was no longer just a name. It had become a mask, a shield, a monument to a woman the world thought they understood. But they didn't know the version of Edith who stood alone at 3 a.m., staring at the empty space where Morton Fullerton used to sit. Years had passed. The letter he sent had turned to ash, but the words were burned deeper into her than any page she had ever written. I loved you, it said. But love, she had learned, wasn't about words. It was about showing up. And he hadn't. Because while the world lost its shine, she was only now beginning to speak. In 1911, she published Ethan Frome, a story so tragic, so suffocating, that readers called it cruel. But they didn't know the truth. It wasn't fiction. It was memory disguised. It was everything she couldn't say to Teddy, everything she couldn't scream at Fullerton. It was love, paralyzed. And then came the Age of Innocence. Written after the war, in a world no longer innocent, it was her rebellion dressed in nostalgia. The story of a man who almost escapes tradition, almost reaches for the woman he truly wants, only to return to the cage he was born into. Society praised it as a masterpiece of restraint, but restraint was just the word people used when they didn't understand pain. It won her the Pulitzer Prize. She was the first woman in history to receive it. She should have felt triumphant, vindicated. But when the letter arrived, she didn't scream, didn't laugh, didn't even smile. She folded it, placed it on her writing desk, and stared at it like it was a goodbye, because she knew, deep down, it wasn't her best work. That night, she poured herself a glass of red wine, stood on her Paris balcony, and whispered to the wind, "They finally gave me the prize for a lie." Her maid found her there hours later, asleep in a chair, the glass still half full. Paris, for all its beauty, had become a mausoleum. The salons were quieter now. Her friends older, many gone. Henry James, her beloved friend and rival, had died. His absence left a silence no library could fill. They used to debate for hours about characters, morality, style, but the truth was, he was the only one who ever saw through her, and now he was gone too. She thought often about America, but going back wasn't an option. New York had become something unrecognizable. Skyscrapers now reached higher than the old mansions she once visited. The people were faster, hungrier, louder, and Edith had written too many ghosts into the walls of that city. She couldn't go back, not when she had spent her life trying to escape it. Instead, she bought a villa in the south of France, a place with no past, just olive trees and sun. And it was there, surrounded by silence and stone, that the memories came flooding in, not just of Fullerton or Teddy, but of herself. The girl who used to stare out the window, writing imaginary letters to authors she would one day stand beside. The teenager who once dreamed of climbing mountains just to see if the world looked different from above. The young bride who wanted to be loved, not for her mind, but for her madness. She realized something terrifying then. She had traded the girl for the genius, the dreamer for the discipline, and now, with the world growing quieter and her body growing slower, she wondered if it was worth it, if the words were enough to replace the warmth, if the pages she'd written were really better than the hands she'd never held again. One night, as a storm rolled across the hills, she lit a candle and opened her oldest journal, the one she hadn't touched since Fullerton vanished. Inside were unfinished poems, scraps of unsent letters, and one line written in her own hand that made her breath catch. "I would have given it all up, if he had only asked." The candle flickered. The wind howled, and for the first time in years Edith cried. Not the tears of heartbreak or grief, but of release. Because the truth was, no one had ever really asked her what she wanted. Not Teddy, not Fullerton, not the publishers, not the world. They wanted her to be a genius, a woman who overcame, a symbol. But never just Edith. And now it was too late. Or maybe it wasn't sit. She got up, picked up her pen, and began to write not a novel, not a story, but a confession. "My name is Edith Wharton," she wrote, "and I have spent my life building cathedrals from pain." The page trembled beneath her hand. "I have loved men who couldn't love me back. I have told the truth in books because I was too afraid to speak it aloud. I have won prizes I did not want and been praised for a silence that nearly killed me." She stopped, listened to the thunder, then kept going. "But I remember everything, and before I leave this world, I will no longer pretend." She wrote until the candle burned out, until her hand ached, until the rain stopped. She didn't know if anyone would read it. She didn't care. This wasn't set for them. It was for her. When morning came, the sun touched her desk like a soft apology, and for the first time in decades, she smiled without armor. Because the final chapter was hers, not written by editors, or history, or men, but by a woman who had finally remembered her name. Edith stood at the edge of the terrace in Montreux, where the cold Swiss air kissed her skin like a secret waiting to be whispered. The lake stretched before her like a glass pane about to crack. Behind her, the rustling of delicate silk and hushed voices floated from the salon, where Parisian exiles and literary expatriates raised their glasses to something they no longer believed in. But Edith, she was waiting for the past to finally catch up. Because the truth, the part no biographer ever captured, was that Edith Wharton's novels weren't just fiction. They were coded maps of forbidden moments, of faces she dared not name aloud. There had been one in particular, not Morton Fullerton, though the world loved to stop the story there. No, that was just the decoy. The man she mourned, even now, had no letters left behind, only silence. By 1917, the war had cracked Europe open like an egg, spilling truth, rot, and courage across its shell. Edith had crossed into combat zones to write real stories, to witness what the salons of New York could only pretend to understand. But somewhere between Verdun and Paris, she disappeared from the literary headlines. The world moved on. It always does. But that didn't mean the story was over. In a quiet village outside Saint-Brieuc, a young French archivist named Lucy found something she wasn't meant to. A letter, sealed in oilskin, buried beneath a loose floorboard in the chapel Edith had once donated to restore. The handwriting was unmistakable, not Edith's, but the one who had loved her, the one she had erased. Lucy didn't know what she held, not at first, but the words inside were like a ghost, rising from decades of dust. You told me once that God had forgotten us, but I never did. Even when the world collapsed, even when you vanished behind silence and books, I remembered every evening in Florence, every night in Berlin. Your words built empires, but you were my rebellion. Yours in silence, E. E. Who was E? Not a name found in any index, not a politician, not a novelist, just an echo. Lucy followed the clues like a novel, cross-referencing train tickets, comparing ship manifests, interviewing elderly villagers who remembered an American woman with eyes that saw too much. The trail led her to a cottage hidden behind ivy and old iron gates, Edith's final escape from the world, a place she had never listed in any memoir. There, in the attic, Lucy found the proof no historian had ever dared claim: a portrait, painted in the style of Whistler, and behind the canvas, stitched into the fabric, one final page in Edith's own hand. Let history worship statues. I built no monument, only a story wide enough to hide one love I refused to let the world consume. For a week, Lucy said nothing. She knew what she had. A scandal, yes, but something deeper, a window into how Edith had defied an entire century's worth of judgment, not by shouting, but by writing, not by explaining, but by erasing just enough. Back in New York, the social registers that once worshipped Edith had long moved on. The Astors were relics. The Gilded Age had been replaced by war and jazz and skyscrapers. But beneath the marble halls of the Mount, the estate she had once called home, Edith's shadow lingered. Not in the architecture, in the air, like a question no one dared ask. The academic world recoiled, speculative, romanticized. There is no definitive proof, they said. But readers knew. Millions read her novels again, this time hunting for what they'd missed. The lines between fact and fiction blurred. Who was Lily Bart really? In 2025, Netflix offered a deal. A limited series, Wharton's War. Lucy declined the producer's first pitch. Too soft, she said. You're missing the rage. The second script was closer. By the third rewrite, they had it. Not just the love story, but the war, the one between the woman and the cage built around her. The Gilded Age hadn't just swallowed Edith. It had tried to silence her, but somehow she had survived it. Not by breaking the rules, but by rewriting them in ink too elegant to erase. And now, a century later, we're finally listening. So when you hear her name again, on a book cover, in a lecture, whispered between marble columns, remember the crown she wore was invisible. But it was never fragile. It was forged in defiance, stitched in longing, and sealed with silence. Edith Wharton's secret is no longer buried. The room was quiet, too quiet. Edith sat alone, the open envelope resting on her lap like a ghost that had clawed its way out of the grave. The letter she had once buried with trembling hands now pulsed with the weight of its contents, breathing new life into a past she had tried to kill. But the past, as she was learning, has a pulse of its own, and it was awake. Outside, the chariots of Fifth Avenue still rolled by, but inside her grand home, time had stalled. Not even the ticking of the antique clock dared interrupt what had just unfolded. The letter had been read. Its final sentence echoed in her mind like a curse. If you're reading this, then you finally admitted what you did to us both. Behind her, the fire sputtered, as if reacting to the tension. She turned toward the hearth and stared into the flames, remembering him, not Teddy, not the husband who had numbed her soul, but the man she had left behind in Paris, the writer, the Frenchman, the only man who had ever truly known her, and the only man whose heart she broke by vanishing. She hadn't run because of shame. She had run because of duty, and because she knew if she stayed, she'd never leave. That was the real betrayal, not the affair, not the lies, but the silence. She had let an entire life die in the shadows, and now the world was clawing toward the truth. The next morning, the Times published what they called an unopened chapter in Edith Wharton's life, a bold title for what was, in truth, still fragments and whispers. The journalist had pieced together enough to hint at a hidden affair, a disappeared man, and a lost child that was never named. No sources confirmed, no dates given, just implications. But that was enough. New York smelled blood. Reporters circled her block. Former friends wrote coy editorials questioning her real legacy, and distant relatives, who had once vanished from her life like ghosts, now reappeared with questions that were barbed in silk. She didn't leave her home for 3 days, and when she finally did, she wore black, not for mourning but for armor. Even in scandal, she knew how to rule a room. She stepped into the Metropolitan Club as if nothing had happened. Until she saw him. Across the dining room, seated with 3 publishers and a young playwright, was William Bradford, the son of the editor at Harper's Weekly. He looked up, smiled, then tipped his glass in her direction. She knew what that meant. It wasn't just flirtation, it was possession. He knew everything, or worse, he thought he did. And he would write, because scandal sells more than literature ever could. That night, Edith did something she hadn't done in 12 years. She wrote a short story. Not for publication, not for fame, just for herself. It began with a woman alone in a ballroom, listening to music no one else could hear. It ended with her walking into the night, barefoot, leaving behind diamonds on the marble floor like breadcrumbs no one would follow. She wasn't afraid anymore, not of William, not of the whispers, not even of the truth. What could they do to her now? Only the truth, and that belonged to her. The next morning, she sent a telegram to Paris, to an address she had memorized decades ago. No return name, just a sentence. I kept it, I read it, and I sit and ready. 2 weeks passed. Nothing. And then, one envelope arrived. French postmark. Below it, a note in delicate handwriting. His name is Etienne. He is 21. He has your fire. Come before it burns him. She dropped the photo. Her knees gave way, not out of weakness, but because the story she thought was buried had just grown a second act. And she wasn't just a character in it anymore. She was the author. She should have turned back the moment she stepped into the apartment. But Edith didn't believe in omens. Not until that day. The soft ticking of a forgotten clock, the faint scent of tobacco that hadn't been smoked in years, and the flicker of a shadow down the corridor, none of it stopped her, because somewhere, buried beneath this gilded city of noise and lies, was her truth. And now, someone had uncovered it. A single envelope sat on the dining table. Her name, no address. Just Edith written in a trembling hand. She opened it slowly. The paper inside was yellowed, the ink faded, but the words were sharp as ever. You lied. To them. To him. But not to yourself. The rest was blank. She collapsed into the nearest chair, pulse racing. Who would send this? Who would send this? Who knew? There were only 3 people who ever held the full truth, and 2 were dead. Or so she thought. Back in 1896, she had burned the letters. Every one of them. Letters from Landor, the man who was supposed to have died in Spain, the man whose mind she had tried for years to erase. They had written to each other like prisoners escaping through pages. He was the only one who ever saw her, not as Edith the novelist, nor Edith the wife, nor Edith the hostess, but simply Edith, the girl who once hated her corset and dreamed of open fields, not opera boxes. But Landor vanished after a scandal in Madrid. A duel, a disappearance, a closed casket. And Edith, 24, had cried in silence and married a man her mother approved of. Yet now, in this tiny Manhattan apartment above 5th Avenue, someone was reminding her that the past never dies. It waits, patiently. She went to the fireplace. Ashes still clung to the base. She sifted through them, frantic. Had she missed something? Had she left a trail? No, she had been too careful. Always. Or maybe it wasn't about Landor at all. Maybe it was about Paris. The Paris affair had never been written, never spoken of, never even fully admitted to herself. A time when Edith had fled from New York's high society under the guise of creative solitude, when in truth she had drowned herself in a world of painters, poets, and a woman named Cecile, whose touch left her unable to sleep. That part of her life was buried so deep that not even her most trusted editor, Charles, knew the full extent. But someone did, because the next morning she found another note, this time at her doorstep. Paris, 1900, on Rue des Martyrs. Do you remember? She dropped it like it burned her fingers. Or worse, trying to publish something. She cancelled all engagements that day, something unheard of for a woman of her name. The servants whispered behind her back. Society would notice, but she didn't care. She had to find Charles. If there was any unpublished manuscript that hinted at those lost years, he would know, and if he had betrayed her, God help him. His office smelled of ink and whiskey as always. His eyes widened when he saw her. Edith, you look like you've seen a ghost. Maybe I have, she whispered. She laid the notes in front of him. He read them slowly, twice. Then he leaned back. You're not going to like what I'm about to say. Try me. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a thick stack of pages. She stared at the title, The Forgotten Hours. It was her handwriting, but she never wrote anything by that name. She flipped through the first page, then the second, and then she froze. Because this wasn't just writing. It was confession. Every detail, every word, every secret. Pages of her Paris years. The nights, the guilt, the love, and the betrayal. Even Landor, even Cecile. She looked up, breathless. Where did this come from? He shook his head. I don't know. There was no return address. Just the pages and that note. She couldn't speak. The manuscript read like a ghost had possessed her hand, or like someone had stolen the words straight from her soul. It wasn't just a threat. It was a declaration. Someone was going to expose her, but who? She left Charles's office with the pages clutched to her chest like stolen treasure. She couldn't let this leak. Not now. Not when she was finally respected by both the East Coast elite and the Paris literary salons. Her name had become something powerful, clean, impeccable. And if these pages surfaced, it would all come crashing down. At 2 a.m. there was a knock at the door. She froze. The staff had retired. She approached slowly. Another envelope slid under the door. She opened it. This isn't set revenge. This is liberation. No threats, no demands, just a message. She stared into the mirror. 41, hair pinned too tightly, eyes that forgot how to cry. She no longer recognized herself. Whoever was behind this wasn't trying to destroy her. They were trying to free her. But from what? She didn't sleep that night. The letter from Morton Fullerton sat on her writing desk like a live fuse. Edith stared at it from across the room, wrapped in a velvet robe, the gaslight flickering off the gilded wallpaper. Outside, the snow fell in heavy silence across Park Avenue, but inside her mind there was only noise. Every word he'd written replayed over and over. The memories it stirred had claws. He was back. Are you well? Do you still write in the mornings with tea and toast? Did you ever publish our story? It wasn't the questions that haunted her. It was the signature, the curve of his M, the way he still signed it, yours. And suddenly she was 43 again, flushed in silk, hair pinned back with trembling hands, waiting for him outside the Jardin du Luxembourg. She hadn't remembered how loud her heart could get. She hadn't wanted to. But this time, she didn't burn the letter. She folded it slowly, slid it into the drawer with all the others, the ones she'd sworn never to open again. The truth was, she had never really closed the door, not on Morton, and not on the version of herself that had dared to live for more than duty. She descended the marble steps of her brownstone and gave instructions to the coachman. "Take me to West 47th, number 204. He raised an eyebrow. "The printing press. Masipan." She nodded once. If Morton wanted to know whether she'd written their story, he was about to find out. The print shop was a relic. Oil lamps hung from the rafters. Ink-stained men shouted over the grinding clatter of metal. Edith stepped inside and silence fell like snowfall. She was a legend, but rarely seen here. "I need a private run." "Confidential," she said. The owner, a red-nosed Irishman with a soft spot for her work, ushered her upstairs. "What sips the piece, Miss Wharton?" She hesitated. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out the original manuscript, unbound, yellowed, 472 pages of forbidden confession. He stared at the title, "The Palace Within." She had written it 12 years ago in secret, hidden it behind the false panel in her bedroom wall, never meant to show anyone. And yet here she was. "I want 50 copies, leather-bound, anonymous author." He blinked. "It's fiction?" Edith gave him a long look. "It's a secret, until it's not." It took 3 weeks. And in those 3 weeks, Edith became someone else. She stopped attending the Literary Society luncheons, declined all invitations from Mrs. Astor and the Vanderbilt heirs. She took long, cold walks through the park. She read poetry again, and when no one was looking, she reread his letters, each one marked by the wax seal she'd memorized like a scar. When the books arrived, she touched them like they were relics from another world. Burgundy leather, gold embossing, no name, just the story. She mailed one to a single address, 11 Rue de l'Université, Paris. No note, just the book. She kept another for herself. The rest she sent to libraries, secret collections. One to a bookseller in Vienna who dealt in anonymous scandals of the elite. One to a woman's salon in San Francisco known for publishing banned works. And then she waited. Weeks passed. No reply, no letter, no telegram, no scandal. Until one afternoon, she stepped into the Astor Library, gloved and veiled, and saw a girl no older than 21, curled in a corner, reading The Palace Within, eyes wide, cheeks flushed, lips parted. Edith approached slowly. "Do you like it?" The girl looked up, startled. "Its steps incredible. Do you know who wrote it?" Edith only smiled. "No, but I hope she writes more." That night, back in her study, she stared at the fire. There had been no explosion, no social shunning, just silence, and maybe that was louder. But 2 days later, the second explosion came. A letter, sealed with red wax, Parisian postmark. She didn't open it immediately. She just sat there with it in her hands, feeling the heat through the envelope. When she finally did, it was just one sentence, written in his hand. "I read every word and I remember everything." No name, no return address. But she didn't need one. She cried that night, not because she missed him, but because part of her had finally been seen. Not Edith the wife, not Edith the proper novelist, not even Edith the Duchess of Decorum, but Edith the woman, the one who had dared to be reckless once, who had loved and lost and written it down anyway. For weeks after that, something shifted. Strangers began writing letters to anonymous columns, quoting her book. Whispers in salons circled about the lady behind the pages. People wondered, was it real? Was it Edith? And that sips when the Times printed it. Could Wharton be the woman behind The Palace Within? She denied it publicly. Of course she did. But privately, she didn't care anymore. She'd told her truth, hidden between fiction and fog. Because Edith had finally chosen herself. Not society, not approval, not even legacy, just truth. And it didn't matter if the world applauded or ignored her. For the first time in her life, she didn't need their permission to feel alive. As winter turned to spring, she began writing again. But this time not to impress. The snow outside Lenox had long melted, But inside Edith's estate, the air was colder than ever. The Gilded Age had swallowed her generation whole, but it hadn't choked on her secrets. Not yet. The ink had barely dried on her last letter to Anna Baumann, that loyal shadow who had known too much and said too little. But now Anna was gone, and with her the silence Edith had so carefully maintained was cracking. Edith stood in her study, her hands trembling slightly over a worn leather folio. Inside was a manuscript, not a novel, not a short story, but a memoir, unpublished, unseen, unforgiving. It had been written in pieces over decades, moments stolen between Paris salons and New York dinners, typed furiously in secret while she pretended to be sketching floor plans or advising Roosevelt's wife on decorum. The memoir was the one place she had ever told the truth, and now it was staring back at her. The pages detailed not only her passion for Morton Fullerton, but her bitter disgust at the hypocrisy of the world she helped define. Names, places, affairs, betrayals. The book had teeth. And now that Anna was gone, her oldest confidant, there was no one left to keep Edith from considering the unthinkable. Not under her name, of course. Never, but anonymously, carefully, quietly. Let the world speculate. It would destroy families. It would expose secrets that had remained buried beneath layers of lace, champagne, and propriety. But wasn't that the point? She had spent a lifetime dressing the wounds of her era with fiction. It was time to show the scars. As Edith leaned over the typewriter again, ready to add the final chapter, a knock echoed through the quiet of the house. Not a servant's knock. Sharp, commanding. She opened the door to find Henry Vanderslice, not just a lawyer, but one of the most ruthless estate handlers in Boston. And with him a letter, sealed in deep blue wax, the crest unmistakable. Astor. Caroline Astor had been dead for years, but her descendants were very much alive and very aware of what Edith had in her possession. "You know," Henry began, voice smooth as glass, "there are some things better left out of the light." She said nothing. "We understand a certain document exists, one that could cause a re-evaluation of several important legacies." Edith didn't blink. "If it were to appear," he continued, "it would not only damage reputations, it could invalidate trusts, wills, influence. Entire families would suffer." "That sounds like a personal problem," Edith replied coldly. Henry smiled. "Not if we solve it now." He extended a thick envelope. Inside was a staggering offer, not just money, but access. Papers, archives, names Edith had been fighting to access for years. A trade. Silence, in exchange for truth. She took the envelope but said nothing. Not then. Later, alone in her room, Edith stared out over the Berkshire Hills. She thought of Henry James, long dead. She thought of Morton Fullerton, likely still charming heiresses in dim Paris corners. She thought of Anna, buried under wet leaves, her letters burned by Edith's own trembling hand. And then she thought of the women, the quiet ones, the ones who never got to write, the ones whose stories had been rewritten by husbands, erased by families, silenced by scandal. She couldn't be one of them. Not now. Edith returned to her study and lit a candle. She opened the manuscript and began to read it aloud, as if invoking the ghosts one last time. With each page her voice grew stronger. The house creaked with memory. Then she took a pen and signed the last page, not with her name, but with one the world would learn soon enough. The next morning, the manuscript was gone, slipped into a package, addressed to a publisher who specialized in anonymous memoirs. And with that, Edith Wharton stepped back from the edge of her reputation and into something far riskier, immortality. But fate wasn't set done with her yet. A week later, a fire broke out in her Lenox home. Not an accident, not random. Investigators claimed it was faulty wiring. But Edith knew that letter from Henry hadn't just been a warning, it had been a threat. And now the house that had seen so many lies stitched into luxury was nothing more than ash. But the manuscript, it had already arrived in New York. And somewhere in a dusty publishing house on Broadway, an editor with trembling hands opened it. By the time Edith had relocated to France permanently, whispers of the anonymous Exposé had already begun to circulate in tight Gilded Age circles. Names were being connected, scandals reconsidered, families panicking. And Edith, far away, sat in her rose garden sipping tea, watching her story burn through the world she had once designed like a house of cards. But she wasn't set celebrating, and hers had only just begun. Attached was a photograph. It showed Morton Fullerton, with a woman, a child, and a date, 1914. The war had barely begun, but the real explosion was only now reaching her. Had he lied? Had he moved on while she poured her grief into fiction? Or worse, had he kept a family secret from her, one she had no place in? Edith stared at the photograph for a long time. Her hands shook. She had built her entire narrative on the idea of sacrifice, that she had given up everything for art, for love, for legacy. Again, she burned it down and built her own. The world would one day call it fiction. And the Gilded Age, that glittering facade of wealth and silence, would never recover from it. She stood before the mirror in her Paris apartment, the light of late afternoon catching on the silver in her hair. Edith Wharton was older now, 70 perhaps, but there was a glimmer in her eye that hadn't dimmed. Outside, the world had changed. The Gilded Age had collapsed under its own gold-leaf illusions, and the Jazz Age danced on its grave. But in that quiet room, time didn't exist, only memory. She reached into a drawer and pulled out the faded photograph she had once hidden behind volumes of poetry. His eyes still pierced her like they did the day they met, but this time there was no ache, only clarity. Paris had given her freedom, yes, but also isolation. She had been a queen in New York, surrounded by maids, carriages, and soirees, where men whispered and women schemed, but she had never been seen. Not truly, not until he came along. The letter she held was never sent. Its paper had yellowed, the ink smudged, but the words, they were alive. She read them now like she always did when she needed to remember who she had once dared to be. "If I am ever remembered," it began, "I hope they see the woman who walked away from her own empire, just to feel what it was like to be kissed under a rain-soaked umbrella in Rome." For decades, the world had praised her novels, dissected her prose, worshipped her wit, but they had missed the point. Every page she wrote was a confession wrapped in fiction. Every heroine carried fragments of the life she couldn't publicly live. She had exposed her soul in plain sight, and no one noticed. Until now. A knock at the door shattered the stillness. It wasn't the maid. Edith slowly crossed the room, heart thudding like it hadn't in years. She opened the door and froze. It wasn't him. Of course it wasn't. He was long gone. But the woman standing there looked just like someone out of her past. A young journalist, wide-eyed, hesitant, holding a book, one of hers. "Madame Wharton?" the girl asked. Edith nodded slowly, her voice quiet. "Yes?" "I came to ask about this line," the girl said, flipping open the worn novel. "That she traded a palace for a heartbeat, and never once looked back. Do you mean it? Was it real?" The question hit harder than Edith expected. No one had asked her that before. People praised her structure, her metaphors, her ability to dissect society's flaws. But not this, not the truth buried beneath all the layers. She took a breath. "Yes," she said, "it was real." And just like that, the air in the room shifted. The silence was no longer empty. It pulsed with the weight of a truth finally spoken aloud. The journalist smiled. "People think you were a product of the Gilded Age, but I think you were a warning." Edith chuckled softly. "Or a witness," she corrected. "I watched a world drown in its own illusion, and when I escaped, I wrote The Raft." She invited the girl inside. Tea was poured, stories exchanged, and for the first time in years, Edith didn't feel like a relic. She felt like a spark. Night fell, and the journalist left, clutching her notebook as if it contained a secret treasure. Edith stood at the window, watching the girl vanish into the Paris dusk, and in that moment, she understood something. History doesn't always honor the loudest voices or the richest men. Sometimes it honors the woman who bled truth onto paper and trusted the future to find her. The next morning, the letter was gone, burned perhaps, or maybe left behind in a drawer for someone else to discover. But its words were already out there, disguised in stories whispered through time. And the woman who once ruled New York without a crown, she had finally told her story. No titles, no scandals, no regrets. Only truth. Only Edith. If this story moved you, it's time to make sure the world doesn't forget women like Edith Wharton, the ones who lived in shadows but left behind light. Subscribe to The Untold Woman for more cinematic, forgotten stories of the women who shaped history without ever asking for credit. Hit the bell, share this video, and comment below, because these stories matter. Thank you for watching.